All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Now, we have a new face up here. So before we go too much further, Mr. Snook wandered off. John, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and why you're here.
Sure. Thank you for asking me to come. My name is Jonathan Washburn. I am a member at Grace Church of Mentor over on 306. I was a Christian school teacher in Charleston, South Carolina for about 8 years. I have a master's degree in Christian apologetics. I moved to Mentor, Ohio about 7 years ago, and I desperately wanted to get a job at a Christian school here teaching Bible and history. I actually applied at Cornerstone.
There are no connections to any Christian schools here today.
I applied at Cornerstone, and they told me, well, we already have a pretty good Bible and history teacher, so we don't need your help. And that was this guy sitting right beside me.
Would you guys agree with that?
So yeah, I got out of teaching, and I'm a mortgage loan originator now, but I teach at my church with the in the college and career class at my church, and do a couple other things in the community. But yeah, have a master's degree in Christian apologetics, have a little bit of a background in some of the things that you're talking about, met you through some mutual friends, and you asked me to come, and I'm excited to be here today talking about this with you and Tom.
Good, and you've been involved in a lot of the events that have gone on in the community. Tell us a little bit about a couple of those.
Yeah, so I helped to organize a Mentor Racial Justice event that went on here.
That was my fault.
For a couple years. So I organized that with a buddy of mine who is not a believer, but I just kind of became acquaintances with him and was able to kind of collaborate with him. We did one year where it was where we had a focus on faith and race relations here in Mentor. So we got to have local pastors come and talk, and we did another year where we focused on race relationships with police officers. So we had we organized a Chop It Up with a Cop conversation at Mentor City Hall with Mentor and Mentor on the Lake police officers, trying to do my best to be salt and light in an area of the political discourse that is not always filled with salt and light. So I've done that, and I've taught in chapel at Cornerstone several different times, and do stuff at my church. So those are some of the things that I do in the community. Coach soccer. I just came from a soccer game early this morning. That's why I was a little bit late, so I apologize for that.
It's kind of a priority, right? It's your kid's soccer game,
yes,
too. So
my son's soccer game, yes.
So my church knows that my kids come before anyone here, so.
Right.
So yeah. So the purpose of this third session is to discuss the concept and the idea of Christian nationalism. Has anyone heard that word? Does anyone know how to define that word? No? The people using the word don't know how to define it either. So don't worry. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But if you watch the news for very long, you will find out that anything ranging from having a religious belief and voting based upon it, all the way to believing everyone should also hold that belief, is the range of what they could mean by Christian nationalism. So what we're going to do over the next hour, and is it okay if we run over a little bit with people? Okay? If not, just leave. Like we won't be upset. Although we might get offended. I know Mr. Snook's got a deadline, so we'll kind of keep to his deadline on that. And John, we didn't talk about running over with you, so we'll try to just keep this to just shy of an hour from now, because we've gone a couple minutes already. But the goal is to help you guys be equipped to go out and have conversations. So when you encounter someone who says, well, that's just Christian nationalism, how do you respond to that? That's what we want to talk about. So the first question that I've got for these guys, and as we go through this discussion, is what is and how would you define Christian nationalism?
Well, we've already talked amongst ourselves, so we'd be on the same page.
We need you to use your microphone. Oh. Even though everyone can hear, we need to pick it up on the recording.
I'm sorry. All right. So we believe, or I believe, basically that it's an exclusive government or an exclusive governance model or method that uses Christian biblical principles and worldview. So, yeah. I mean, it's a governance mechanism or an instrument or a model or a method. If you go online, you're going to see a lot of different definitions, okay? And the one that I found most is it is basically the running forward with the governance mechanism of a Christian biblical worldview.
Yeah, I think it's very important to try to define this because, as you know, anyone that gets to define the terms of a debate usually gets to win the debate.
Sounds like Karl Marx to me. I believe he said that.
That's right. If you watch the news, a Christian nationalist is essentially any Christian that votes politically in any way. And I don't think that's a good definition of Christian nationalism. I do think there's sort of a difference in what I would define as like Christian nationalism proper, which is what Mr. Snook defined, and then sort of like an undercurrent of Christian nationalism philosophy that can sort of affect how you view political ideas, and we'll get into that a little bit, I think. But yeah, I like his definition. We can just use that for now. This idea that a nation should be run exclusively based off of Christian values, and there's all sorts of questions and potential problems that are going to arise from this. Right?
Do they have the third outline of the things that I provided?
I believe it.
Yes.
I believe it was
Okay,
the last page
Okay,
of your 14
because what
pages.
we're looking at is, do we want a theocracy? One other thing I wanted to add to the Christian worldview emphasis as a leading factor in how the governance works is that there's a primary focus is on the internal politics in society, such as legislating civil and criminal laws that reflect Christian values in society. And recently, there was a case where a particular person was up for the death penalty, and the prosecuting attorney quoted Genesis 9, and it caused the case to be thrown out. Genesis 9, if you shed the blood of a man, your blood should be shed too. And so immediately the court reeled back on that, and the jury went back saying, oh no, we got a fundamentalist as a prosecutor.
So you mentioned a word there that I don't know if everyone's familiar with. You mentioned the word theocracy. Could you kind of talk on that for a moment?
Theo, God, cracy is basically, or kratia, how a thing is ruled. So a theocracy is God rules. Israel was originally a theocracy. And in Jeremiah 33:22, where I pointed out, the Lord is king, the lawgiver, and I have a mental lapse here.
Judge.
Judge, there you go. So the three different branches of our own government follow the idea of Jeremiah 33:22, which would be a theocracy.
Good. So there's a
God's all three.
Sorry, there's a real connection then with the idea of Christian nationalism, at least from the media perspective and the way we hear it, and theocracy.
That's what they would like to have people think that we want.
Okay. So how
And we know it doesn't work because Israel proves it doesn't.
how would that play out in reality? Those who push in that direction, what would that look like?
Well, it goes without saying, the second point here, what can be achieved by a Christian nationalist platform? I mean, what's the criteria for what that Christian leader looks like? What does he or she believe that is consistent with biblical theology? And we know within our Protestant tradition, there are a variety of different interpretations of what that should look like, or is like, or isn't like. And so, I mean, if you look here in your notes, what does it imply socially? Well, it implies socially, if we are to have a Christian theocracy, if there was a Christian nation, then what is the two most important teachings of Jesus that needs to be exercised and demonstrated on a regular basis? Well, the answer is is in the Great Commandment, right? You love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind. Second's like the first, you love your neighbor like yourself. So the law of love is the primary motivating extension of who God is. If God is love, he's also just in how he measures love or no love. So that's kind of a hard thing maybe to push aside and say, no, there's something else. Because I'm compelled to think that if Jesus was asked what's the great law, what's the most important thing to believe? It's to love God. Then in a theocracy, then your duty as a citizen is to love God first. And secondly, to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you don't love God, then perhaps you should be held suspect by the government. And if you don't love your neighbor, then you're certainly held suspect by the other neighbors. You follow me? So the law of love is a pretty powerful law of the land. And it's, as John mentions in 1 John chapter 5, and his laws are not burdensome. His commandments are not burdensome. So you know when love works, and you know when it doesn't. But it's not perfected in a fallen world with fallen people unless they obey the perfect one who made the law.
So, John, you look like you're deep in thought. So I believe, one of the things I said to them in talking about this is I think the process is sometimes more important than the outcome. So I'm one of those people who I think best when I talk. So you'll see me driving down the road talking to myself. And yes, I do answer myself too. I ask questions and answer them. So I want to pull what's running through your mind and see if I can pull that out for a minute.
Sure. Yeah, I think the Christian nationalism question is so interesting because I think we would all agree that as Christians, in relation to what should we do as citizens in our politics, we should obviously act as citizens and vote in our politics in a way that we believe God would have us act and vote, right? We should obviously vote in a way that we think Scripture would guide us. And it sounds like a but is coming, and you're like, why would a but come after that? The but is coming in terms of motivations. Here's what I would allow me to take like a 3-minute story, okay? When I was in 4th grade, Frito-Lay came out with this promotional tool. They put these little tags on the back of every single potato chip bag in America. They called them Planet Lunch Ploids. Every single potato chip bag in America had one Ploid on it. And if you collected 100 Ploids, you could turn them in for a water bottle. And if you collected 1,000 Ploids, you could turn them in for like a lunchbox. And if you collected 50,000 Ploids, you could turn them in for a gym bag. Now,
The fact that you remember this is amazing.
Well, I remember it because my best friend
You were
Zach.
eating a lot of chips.
Oh man! So my best friend Zach Roshi in 4th grade got obsessed with this because the gym bag was pretty sweet, I have to say. And he was like, if I collect 50,000 of these Ploids, I can get a gym bag. So he would go around every day at lunch for the entire school year in the lunchroom and get everybody's Frito and Cheeto and Dorito bags. And every day at lunch, he's collecting 60 to 80 Frito bags, and everyone made fun of Zach. Dude, the Ploid master, right? Like, what are you doing? This is so stupid. He's literally digging through the trash cans to get these Ploids. And he wound up collecting 50,000 Ploids, and he got this gym bag at the end of the year. And he used this gym bag for like 4 years. It was amazing. And what is the point of my story? Did Zach Roshi care about the Ploids? No. The Ploids were a means to an end, right? What did he really care about? He really cared about the gym bag, right? That's what he really, truly wanted. I think that there is a danger for a lot of Christians where we are using Christianity as the means to get something politically that we really want, and that can be a danger. Because if we're not careful, I think two things that often guide our politics that should never guide our politics are fear and power. And we often allow both fear and power to guide our voting. And it's very easy to say, I'm voting this way because it's Christian. But what is the real reason you're voting a certain way? It's kind of because you want this one guy to be in office, right? So let me just read for you, okay? There's a guy, his name's Stephen Wolfe. He wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. I'm going to give you his definition. Here's his definition from a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. I want you to listen closely. Here's his definition. A totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ. Okay. Now just think about this for a second. If Pastor Mike got up in here on Sunday and talked about living in such a way in order, obeying God, living for God, acting a certain way for God, in order to procure for yourself both earthly and heavenly good, you would probably say, Pastor Mike, this sounds like a prosperity gospel.
I'm laughing because all I ever tell them is bad's coming.
Right? Like,
the Lord might not save you.
like
Be prepared to go in the fire.
I should do this, I should behave this way in order to procure earthly and heavenly good. That's prosperity gospel 101, right? If we hear this in terms of like financial riches, financial gain, we immediately interpret prosperity gospel, this is heresy. We put it into the world of politics. You should vote this way because God's going to bless this nation, because it's good for this. It's because we have to be very careful here. This winds up, I see, it can be an undercurrent that we start using Christianity and Christian values as a means to an end that I am not sure is right. Jesus, John 14:6, what does he say? He says, I am the way, the truth, the life. He does not say, I am the way to the truth and a better life. Is it true that God may bless our nation if we continue following on a good path? Yes. It's also potentially true that he might not bless our nation. He's sovereign over all. He is going to do what he does, right? We ought to do what God wants us to do regardless of what happens to our nation. And so I think what I always think is, I don't think this necessarily changes the person that you actually wind up voting for, or whether you're voting letter A or letter B on the ballot box. But I do think it should maybe sometimes change your motivations behind why you're doing this. Because I think so many times we go into the ballot box with like a utilitarian moral ethic, right? We're John Stuart Mill in the voting booth. And then we come out of the voting booth and we go back to being, good Christian ethicists again. And I think that's where, I don't know that I've ever met a Christian in 2024 that like genuinely wants a theocracy, right? It's a straw man, right? We can be like, here's what Christian nationalism is. I've never met that person. It's not really a problem. But you know who I have met? A whole lot of people that have this idea, this sort of political prosperity gospel, that if we just vote our Christian values, God will bless our nation. And that is something that I think we should be careful of.
It's interesting because while you're talking about that, I'm thinking back to people I've encountered in times and people that I've seen, and really it's a lot of it is, go a little theological for a minute, but a lot of it is applying the promises of Israel to us as a nation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can.
No, I have nothing to say.
That wasn't on the notes. They didn't see that question coming.
I think it's clear to what John said about the Christian in his nation should consider the Christians that lived during the Roman Empire that had experienced a very interesting paradigm shift from the political perspective of ancient Rome. Rome, at the time of Christ, when he was walking on the earth, was very open to different interpretations of how one would express their faith. There was no like law against being a Jew. There was no law against being anything. Okay, as long as you sacrificed to Caesar or you paid your taxes. I mean, Jesus made that clear too. You know, render unto God what's God and what's Caesar's. There wasn't a lot of prosecution of the people who didn't render unto Caesar their homage. There just wasn't no big need to. Rome, Pax Romana, basically had control of the known world by its presence. So whether you liked them or not, you got to be really bad to get in trouble. And that's the only reason Jesus was crucified, at least in the political sense, is because the crowd turned him over to Pilate with the choice that Pilate couldn't avoid. You know, we like Caesar better than Jesus. You know, do you want to let a guy go who is a king? So the Jewish people put Pilate in a particular situation that he could pull himself out of and dishonor his position. But not until probably around AD 50 or so, with a shift of the Roman, I think the emperor was Claudius, Caligula, or one of those, we really started to take issue with Christians in power or Christian influence in such a way that it undermined the presence of Roman popular life. And so Christians started to get labeled as haters and cannibals, and seen as those who didn't love the state. They would be guilty of appealing to heaven as their citizenship. And when Nero finally came on board, it was clear that Christians were public enemy number one. And after that, that's when the persecutions up to Diocletian in the 4th century were just ever present. So Christians had to live in an empire that just totally disliked them. And yet, you've heard the saying, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. People knew that Christians believed in something worth dying for. And it wasn't because they were driving the best chariots in Naples. You know, they were in catacombs. They were in such a lifestyle that looked like the risks were worth the rewards. And so this is why Peter later, in around the time of Nero, wrote that judgment begins in the house of God, you know, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17. You know, if we're going to be examples, then we got to also expect that, you know, judgment's going to come our way, and we're not going to be getting out of this easy.
Yeah, I just think very simply, if you were told that the way you voted wouldn't matter at all, it wouldn't matter. Like, what if you lived in California and your vote never mattered? Ought you still vote the way you ought to vote, the way you believe God would have you vote? Of course. Because the reason we vote is because we want to, because God has asked us to live a certain way, and we are called to live according to that standard, whether or not we are actually bringing about political change. The apostles and the martyrs could not bring about political change in Rome, right? And yet you've got guys like Justin Martyr saying things, you know, we who once killed each other now gladly die for the sake of the gospel, right? They are giving up their lives in order to, they're giving up power. They're putting away their fear in order to do the right thing. And that's how we ought to live politically. There's a group, there's a slant that wants to tell you you have to get out of politics completely or else you're being a Christian nationalist, and it's not that. But if you're in politics for the reason of gaining political power, I don't think that is why a Christian ought to be in politics.
So I want to take a slight shift to something you said during session 2. I think it was session 2. Mr. Snook, in regards to, you said that during Manifest Destiny, the church was hijacked by the thinking. So what I want to do is I want to tie that into to today, and as you said it, this came to mind. I want to tie that into today. Could you talk a little bit about how, and John, please feel free to jump in, how the church was hijacked in that time period by the thinking, and how that could potentially relate to how this extreme version of Christian nationalism could also hijack the church today? What we should watch out for.
Well, first of all, hijacking is being taken someplace that you don't want to go by somebody that you don't like, right? Mm-hmm. So being taken someplace by somebody you don't like to someplace you don't want to go is hijacking. And a lot of people who were going out west at this particular time were led to believe that the land was theirs. There was plenty of disinformation going out that the Indians were not really hostile, that they were known to help people on the wagon trail, which they were known to do. But they certainly weren't going to advertise. You can expect a scalping or two, and if you start with 10, you're going to wind up with 2. So there was a lot of disinformation, misinformation, a lot of advertising that the West was easily won, which would go without saying. This whole idea, if you put Christians in power, then America's going to be great again, or we'll have sailing easy seas. I don't know if that's making the point, but the fact is you have to be careful what you're told is going to happen when you don't know how you're going to get there. And just by simply having people in power, look, let's just take a quick example. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, right? He comes in being known as a man who is a Christian, who has been known to provide Christian context for his political processes and things that he believes in. And within 24 hours, he was labeled as a fundamentalist, as a person that can't be trusted with the reins of government. So to what end, then, is it good if your good works are followed by misrepresentation and vilification that keeps you from doing anything worthwhile? Because you're going to be slammed at every corner. I don't know if that's anything, but they, on the other side of the fence, the liberals would think that he's trying to hijack democracy with his Christian worldview. Just like you hear the liberals accusing Christians and conservatives of hijacking democracy. They're changing our democracy. No, you're changing our democracy. You know, the process revolves around dialogue, and where dialogue is shut down. So this is a danger of a theocracy, though, too. Can a country or a kingdom, let me just back up here first real quick before I say this. In medieval times, most nations believed they were all in concert, which was with a commonly agreed mindset of Christendom. Europe was Christendom. Christ was the king. The kings had sacral rights because the Lord brings up or puts down whoever he wants. Just as the rivers of waters flow, the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. So there was this very easy connection. Well, if I claim myself to be a Christian king, I'm on God's side. He'll bless my country over yours. And even if I don't agree with the French king and I'm the German king, I'm going to win. And it's the same kind of civil war, and you know where I'm going. But
Sounds like Crusades, right?
yeah, and the Crusades too. But when we see people think that they can promise a better country by simply legislating morality, which I think is useful to do, we saw it fail with prohibition. The temperance unions and all the movements that went into trying to establish, let's get rid of the demon rum and the rum runners and see how the country goes. It didn't work. So somehow, and I don't know where I'm going with this other than to say, somehow we have to be careful that we don't buy into promises that are historically proven not to be able to be fulfilled.
Yeah, Spurgeon said it this way, right? Discernment is not the ability to tell the difference between right and wrong. Discernment is the ability to tell the difference between right and almost right. And that's what's so tricky about manifest destiny, right? You hear it and you're like, well, kind of, right? It kind of sounds a little bit good. And you hear a lot of what political people will tell you today on either side, and you'll hear it and you go, maybe. Prohibition, that actually sounds pretty good to me. Drunkenness is a problem. Why wouldn't that work, right? And so if you've ever read C.S. Lewis, the Screwtape Letters, there's like 9 Screwtape Letters like this, right? About one of the best ways to get Christians to fail is to like start off with the truth and just shift it a little bit, right? And so we just have to be much better about being more discerning with things that are right, and this sounds right, it's almost right, but something's wrong, right? The Spirit's talking to me. Why does this feel a little off to me? How can we get this back to what God would have us as Christians do?
Yeah, I think the Founding Fathers understood the importance of spirituality and God-centered communities. And if the vehicle for communication is open on all avenues to say whatever you believe and are at least able to defend it without fear of being ostracized or kicked out of the community, in some ways, don't misunderstand me, in some ways, a secular state that allows freedom of speech is a better place to be, because then I have the truth that I don't have to be afraid of speaking to the hearts that need it most without fear of being convicted of being some kind of a criminal who's trying to take people to heaven. You know? So in a weird way, these last 4 years have shown to a lot of people who are not even believers that there's something wrong with the attempt to create a kind of state that is put together for the best interest of all, but never mentioned at the expense of whom. And I think this is what we hear. And I would rather hear somebody simply say, can we all just get along and each person speak their mind freely and truthfully without consequence? Because I mean, you and I both are, all of us probably in one way or another, are fully aware of where some of the narrative takes us to these unbelievable, unimaginable narratives and moral premises. But all I have to do is say, I don't believe it, and I don't care about it, and hope I'll pray for you. But then when we're told, you need to accept this, or you're a hater, and then that's where I think we lose the ability to even be witnesses. I as a Christian school teacher and a pastor for 34 years, I spent 22 years in manufacturing. And I'll be honest, some of my most interesting ministry was working in the factory and working with other machinists who didn't care at all about God. But every so often they would just simply say, hey, Jesus guy, you know? And they would want to ask me a question. I had a biker guy ask me one day just to just spend some time with him. He said, what do you really believe? And I get talking to him and everything. Next thing I know, he's crying, you know, about some stuff in his life. People need to see that we can't be salt and light without us being, you know, in their face, verse and chapter, or chapter and verse, how you say it, right? Chapter and verse. But just show that we are serious citizens of heaven on our way to a place better than this. But in the meantime, we're here because, like what I said in the beginning in Acts 17, God has put us in a place and a time. So whether we're in a town that is, or a country, or a continent that's corrupt, we're still here. We're still here. And when I talk to people who lived through the Soviet Union and the dominance of Russia in Ukraine in 1994, I was just there 3 years out of communism. So you would not believe the stories that people told. What Christians did to get to where they needed to be in their faith and make a daily living, and still be surprised by certain Soviet police or people who were on the know, who kind of saw what they were doing and just looked the other way sometimes. It was usually those hard-nosed Soviet KGB people who wanted to win points and lock up people. You can only lock up so many. Just like the Romans found that you can only kill so many. You can only kill so many. And eventually people start looking like Romans probably looked at Christians and say, you know what, I think I'd rather die than live like a person whose conscience is conflicted. And on the voting note, that's where I think you have to vote your conscience with conviction. I mean, for me, a no-brainer is anybody who's for abortion, they're done. No, if I can't protect myself, I don't care. I'm not voting for you. Personal liberties, protection, right to life, you know. If God raised up a Democrat who supported pro-life, freedom and the right to bear and keep arms, I don't care what party you are. You're in the ballpark where I'm concerned. Questions?
Yeah. So that last part of there, our allegiance shouldn't be with a party.
Right.
Our allegiance really shouldn't be.
George Washington made it very clear in his second inaugural address that the death of this country would be party politics. And in Federalist Paper number 10, the problem with factions. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton went back and forth on the problem with factions. And that's, remember, our country wasn't founded on a political party. It was founded on the merit of leadership. Meritology is a perspective that probably needs to be brought back up. You all know what meritology is, right? Meritology is your merit brings you to the place of power or leadership.
You raise to the level. You raise to the level of standard of what you can do.
Right.
Like you earn your reward based on that.
Yeah, and most people were seeing people raised to the level of their incompetence or their political party's power to put them there to be a puppet.
So I'm going to jump down to section 3 in our notes because, again, I'm going to summarize something you said, Mr. Snook, in the earlier session, and then we'll ask question A because I think that's a really interesting one. You spoke about Andrew Jackson, and I've been on record in my house, and I'll go on record publicly now as saying I think Andrew Jackson was the worst president we've ever had. So, and that's in light of the last two, who a lot of, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, you usually say it's one of those two, right? So I think it's Andrew Jackson. And I think when we look at what he did with the Trail of Tears and Manifest Destiny and such, I think it's hard to argue against him. But the way you described him was interesting because you described him as a rugged individual, someone who won't back down. And I threw in there the words charismatic leader because I think you were kind of describing him as a charismatic person. So that raises the question, because I think there's someone else in our culture today that would fall under a very similar description to that. What's the litmus test for good leaders? And what would be let's two-part this. What would be the litmus test for good leaders under the Christian nationalist worldview? And then, as we'll say Orthodox Christianity, what would be our litmus test?
I've thought about this a lot, and the first thing I would like to always think, if I'm going to be a leader and have the position to direct the thoughts of individuals, either in a small group or in a large group, would first find out where they are, what they need to say, and what I need to listen to. I really think the teaching maxim that I tried to always employ as an educator was, now actually as an educator in a lecture situation, I have to do the most talking. But in many contexts, I tried to always prove out it's more important to show that you care rather than what you know. It's more important to show how much you care than how much you know. And I think a good leader has to be able to sit still and listen to where people are coming from. Jesus did a pretty good job of this. I mean, he had his moments when he had to lecture and teach, but he was always there and available to answer questions too and be approached, being approachable. And I find it difficult when I listen to candidates and politicians or even situations where there's constant interrupting. Nobody's allowed to finish their thought. Either demonizing or minimizing the importance of the person's statement is just never really good. And the Apostle Paul said in Acts chapter 24, I think, I exercise my conscience to always fear God and basically be respected by men. And I think he did a pretty good job of that when he was in council. He had the opportunity to speak to Agrippa. He had the opportunity to speak to Felix. But he didn't slam them for their position. He just simply took the opportunity to tell his. And when he said all he could say, they looked at him and said, well, we don't find anything wrong with you. But since you appeal to Caesar you must go. So, I mean, by Paul just being honest to people who had power, they saw that he was honest and accepted his. In fact, Agrippa said, now you think I'm going to be persuaded to be a Christian so quickly? And Paul said, yeah, even you and everybody here. But that was it. I mean, you have to put your Christianity and your leadership in the positions God gives you, whether it's in a classroom or in a county seat, to where you show that you value where people are coming from and hopefully show them the respect that they're going to be amazed that you listen to them and say, well, what do you think? Can I say what I think, please? Because like I said before, in witnessing to this biker, he just said, tell me what you do to make you believe what you think is right, and I'll be quiet. He didn't interrupt me once. And I think I probably told him something he heard from his grandmother or something like that. You know what I mean? It just got him in his heart. Got him in his heart.
All right, you asked me this question, so this is not your pastor saying this. This is some guy you've never met that's saying this. So don't be mad at him if you're mad at what I'm going to say. I'll just say a couple things. I'm 37 years old. I grew up listening to my parents listening to Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh and my parents told me every single day that character mattered because Bill Clinton was a bad person with bad character. And then 20 years later, I was told that character no longer mattered because the other side was so bad, it was important that we have the biggest hammer. That always struck me as inconsistent. I've wondered what changed. I asked my parents what changed. And what changed was, well, the other side is so much worse, character doesn't matter as much anymore. So just remember that when you are having these conversations, that things might change. I do believe character matters. I would say this. I've heard multiple times over the last decade the phrase, we're not voting for a pastor. I dislike this phrase very much for several reasons. Number one, it's a problem for me because there is an assumption in there that you essentially have to be a bad person to be successful out in the quote-unquote real world. And my question is, have you read the book of Proverbs? Because if you read the book of Proverbs, it seems to say that the honest person, the just person, the righteous person is the one that has the good life, that does prosper. I'm a loan officer. Are you telling me that in order to be the best loan officer I can be, I should start lying to people, I should start cheating people, I should start stealing from people? Because I believe that in order to be the best loan officer I can be, I should be a loan officer that tells the truth. And I personally believe that the people that I vote for will be the best people if they also tell the truth and if they also abide by a certain standard. What I would say is I do believe that people that we are voting for should attain a certain minimum standard of righteousness. Obviously, we can't be pharisaical about this because we believe that all humans are fallen and nobody is perfect. And I think everyone is probably going to have different sort of thresholds of what their political candidates need to be, and I don't think you need to abide by my threshold necessarily, or that I need to abide by your threshold. But I do believe that character matters in politicians, and that it should be one of the things, maybe not the only thing, but it should be one of the things that we factor in our equation when we are voting. That's one man's opinion. I think Scripture is pretty clear that the character of leaders has an effect on the nation. So that would be my answer. I also have the very easy out here that I am a card-carrying member of something called the American Solidarity Party, and my vote doesn't matter, right? So, I can look at, I'm not voting for either of the two main political party candidates. And if you think that in order to vote your best, you need to vote for someone that has a chance to win, this question is harder for you. Right?
It comes down to a question of
lesser of two evils question is going to be
your
much more
conscience-
difficult
conscience and conviction
there.
as to vote. It's kind of where there's a rise in libertarianism too, just for that same reason.
Yeah, and I did not plan on going down the course of how should we vote. So, but I like the idea of what are those things we ought to look for. And you said I'm not voting for a pastor. And before we even got to that, I almost kind of was thinking about Timothy, where he talks about the roles of an elder and the characteristics of an elder. And with the exception of teaching doctrine, I almost feel like that is a good guide for what we would want as leader. Because at the end of the day, some of those things that he says in that passage, they're really characteristics, like having a good reputation in the community, being patient and kind, and things like that. So.
Right, like along with what I said, like, are you saying then that your pastor would be a bad president? That doesn't make sense to me. Well, you think that
my congregation says yes.
Right? You think
they took a vote? They just sent me a message, unanimous. Yes, he'd be a horrible president.
You think that somebody with all of these characteristics would be a bad choice? This is something. Speaking of Francis Schaeffer, we have allowed the world's philosophy to so corrupt what we are thinking about what it takes to be successful at business, successful at politics, that we're all of a sudden saying, like, actually, we don't want Christian values in this because we actually think it's better to not have Christian values because then he'll just hammer my legislation through. And this is a dangerous place to be in as Christians. And my 9-year-old son knows that I don't like either of the main candidates. A very simple thing. I know that Dad dislikes both of these people because they lie. Well, but John, all politicians lie. I don't have to vote for any of them. That's a pretty black and white thing in Scripture that I can stand on with my son, at least. So I think character matters. There ought to be a minimum threshold, I believe, of character. Like, play it down. Can you vote for a murderer? Right? Can you vote for a bank robber? Can you vote? Okay, so there is something. Okay, we'll walk it through, find a spot, but don't go down this road, well, we're not voting for a passer, so nothing matters. It does matter. Character matters greatly.
Yeah, but I'm going to just say one thing, not in disagreement, but in the process of our redemption, even though the world doesn't like to think, therefore, if any man be in Christ, all things are new. Okay. God used two murderers, Moses and Paul. Paul not necessarily physically on hands as a murderer, but he consented to the murder of Stephen, to the execution of Stephen. And I remember I had some kids one time say, Mr. Snook, why don't you run for Congress or something like that? I said, no, they'll dig up my past. They will. They just find that out. And I just wouldn't want to bring my family through it. So it takes almost a special kind of person to just say, I don't care what my past said, and I'm going to prompt all the kids in the family and all the relatives, okay, Dad did this or that, and, just bear up with it. I hope I can change the world. But I don't know, just to that point, how the world doesn't want to look at the redemptive process as well, where character matters more after salvation. It does matter. Even though, in spite of the fact that one failed. I'd like to know if anybody has any questions or anything. I know you want to wrap up. So.
I've got two on my mind. We'll open up, though. Does anyone have anything that you want to ask? All right, we got one. Say it loud, and I'll try and repeat it.
How do you vote in a world where it is to people that don't show the moral character that you want to see?
So I'll summarize. How do you vote when both people, neither one of them has the moral character we desire?
Personally, I vote for a lot more local and state elections than I do national elections. I have many times left the presidential ballot blank and then voted for senators and representatives and, you know, pieces of legislation. I do not personally believe that I am required to fill out every single mark on the ballot.
Yeah,
Right? That's how I vote.
I agree. When I don't know the name of a person on any ballot, I won't vote for them because I don't know what they stand for. And I saw one guy or one woman sign more than anybody else. Does that mean that they're better? Maybe you can say have more money, right?
More
So
fun.
it's really, to John's point, the knowledge of your local politics, school boards in particular, making your voice known or heard in school boards probably is one of the most effective parts of the political process in city council meetings and stuff like that. But I think also it wouldn't hurt, and I'll just, just say it differently and not disagree with John. If you are a person of conscience, you should see what all the candidates that are out there are saying. And, maybe if that's what you have to vote, your conscience, that you know that they would be the best person who would put that political point of concern in front of Congress or in front of the Senate or House or the state government. Yeah, I think it doesn't do any injustice as long as your conscience is you're okay with their particular stance. So.
I have another one out there. I've never voted for American Idol. So no,
Not
Joe,
even if I was on it?
I'd vote for you, Don. Absolutely. So let me see if I understand right, because I think it's a tough question. So if we choose to sit out the presidency, the vote for the presidency, because both candidates are bad, aren't we handing it over to who we might view as the greater evil? Like, is that kind of what I'm saying? Okay.
I suppose you would have to view one side as the greater evil in order to do that calculus. I view one side as the greater evil on some things, and I view the other side as the greater evil on other things, if I'm just being honest. So, and not all issues are equal, right? That's something that every person is going to feel differently based off of how you view things politically and theologically. Personally, though, I'm strongly convinced that far too many Christians vote based off of fear, and I would much rather be recognized and identified for what I strongly believe in, as opposed to acting in a way based off of what I'm afraid of. I think that's what I'm called to do, and that's how I'm called to act as a Christian. That would be how I would answer that question.
Yeah, Luther made it clear about it's neither right nor safe to be against one's conscience. My conscience is held captive to the word of God. Herein I stand. I can do no other. God help me. And so, that's a driving point. But I also, to this point you're making there, I'm very strongly committed to, even if my voice is a whimper, I still have a voice. And I, in good conscience, cannot sidestep a candidate that I know has national best interest and things that would align at least with things that God would be pleased with, like, pro-life and the right to defend oneself and things like that. So there's other issues, but I tell you what, if you're going to look at politicians and all their lying.
Don't we wish Pinocchio was real?
Yes.
I mean, really, you know, I think I used it already. I used the illustration once about Survivor, you know, getting dropped off on an island and learning how to survive and who's going to rise to leaders. But if you remember that game at all, there's an awful lot of deception going on too to get to places of power and get what you ultimately want. And things like loyalty and honor and honesty are constantly brought up in that game. But it's a game, okay? It's a game. You got to remember that. So lying and deception in a game, just like playing cards. Can I say that? Playing cards.
We don't do
We don't do cards. You don't dance. You don't dance or
I
chew or
caught the
go
women,
girls
I
to
caught
go.
the women's group one day. They were playing games, and I was giving them a hard time about playing cards
But
in church.
I think you get where I'm going. There are so many things we grapple with on a daily basis. It's not like choosing vanilla over chocolate ice cream. It's not like Ford or Chevy. I mean, and we want to think that we're in the place where if it goes down bad, we can say, well, at least I did my part. If it goes up to the way we hope, we can say, well, that's good. Now I really need to pray for you because you better hold your word. You know, that's basically where I come down.
Yeah, you know, I struggled. I really, Jessica would be proud because I haven't answered much and said much. But I really struggled in 2016 with the election. I was telling someone this the other day. I was driving home past my polling. I go past my polling booth on the way home from work that year, and I was trying to still decide what to do. And I ended up decided to sit out in 2016 because it's like I can't vote for this person. I can't vote for that person. Tom mentioned the Libertarian Party is really growing. I distinctly would love to vote Libertarian, but I'm so entrenched. Well, it's not any year yet, right? So entrenched in the belief that life is valuable and we shouldn't murder babies that I couldn't vote for a Libertarian. So I went home and didn't vote in 2016. And in 2020, you know, I went in there and I stared at it and I pushed the button, but I left and, you know, and jokingly but seriously, right? You know what I mean? Jokingly but seriously, I posted on Facebook, you know, there it goes, I did it, I voted, now it's time to go take a shower. Like, it felt dirty, and it didn't feel like there was a not dirty option. And I think we're rolling into that issue again this year, is there's probably not an undirty option. So I think that's a tougher question to answer. I've got, okay, if I could ask one question, then we'll be done.
Okay.
When we're in a conversation with someone and we tell them what we believe, and they say you only believe that because you're a Christian and you're a Christian nationalist, how do we respond?
No, I believe-
Christian nationalist.
I like to think that I believe what I do because God has given me a conscience that has, though, been fallen my whole life. His presence in my life, or just the spirit of truth in the world, guides me to make decisions that are good for myself and those around me. I don't know. Do I have a Christian conscience? Yes, much more so than I ever did before I was converted. But I do think there's an inherent sense of right and wrong still in all people. It really is. That's why I think we see people like who are not religious or Christian starting to see things that are wrong in our country. It's why biker, Bill could talk to me and just try to make sense of what didn't make sense. Because there was something deeper inside of him gnawing at the want for truth. I, for one, would be probably known how I probably will vote because I talk about it, but I never talk about who I'm voting for. I just never talk about voting. It's just how it's always been. It's kind of like a personal thing, okay? But I think you can kind of guess where most people are going. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I say, I believe what I believe because I believe it's true. It's probably the Christian apologetics background coming out. But I do believe Christianity is true, and that's why I believe it. As to the accusation that I'm a Christian nationalist, I would have 5 follow-up questions. I think the most illuminating question you can ever ask somebody is, what do you mean by that?
Yes.
What do you mean when you say Christian nationalist? And I'll let them fill in the blanks, and I'll respond to that. And then a second follow-up is, how did you come to that opinion? right? A great book by Greg Kokel called Tactics, about having conversations with people. What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that opinion? How did you come to that conclusion? So those are the two questions I would ask. Try to follow up and carry the conversation with that. But I think eventually, you know, well, what are you? You're an atheist? Are you an atheist nationalist? What is that? What does this even mean, right? I'm a Christian. I believe it's true. Because I'm a Christian, these beliefs are going to affect how I vote. But I'm not telling you how to vote, right? You know, we're all out here, you know, living the way life the way we can. And of course, I want you to be a Christian. And let's keep talking about it.
So awesome.
So is there a summary you can put to this concept of political Christian nationalism? And talk about it really what this is. And I agree with it a few times. That's great. But where are we at on some of the political groups right now? Is that true? Is that how you interpret it?
So, Mr. Snook, do we need to tell you goodbye? I know you want to get to graduation. you can.
Last year, a year ago, I retired from Cornerstone Christian Academy. So a number of the students graduating this year are students that I had a year ago, and I just
Yeah.
like to be there for that
He's-
graduation. So,
He's got the look on his face Ezra gets when he has to go to the bathroom. except for different reasons. Mr. Snook, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You are a great friend, and I'm proud to have you around. So I will get you guys all a connection to him if you want it in any way, because he's a great person. So let me think if I can try and summarize your question so that I can. So your kind of question is, what's the resolution? What I hear here is, what's the difference between what Christian nationalism means versus how it's used?
All right, I'll give you my honest opinion. I think that this is a conversation you could win individually with friends, but we're probably going to lose it on a big scale with the political discourse. Okay?
Great way of putting it. I love that.
You know how like words just like over time just eventually mean things? Just like they just like, oh, all of a sudden like everything is now racist, right? Like in 1995, racism meant one thing, and now in 2024, everything is just racist in a certain way. I think that's what's going to happen with this. Any Christian that votes in any way that looks like Christianity is just going to be called a Christian nationalist. I firmly believe this. You're already seeing this in the media. So if you're reading online or if you're hearing it on the news, I'm just being prepared to be labeled a Christian nationalist by the news for, I don't know, maybe the rest of my life, or maybe as long as it's popular. 3 years ago it was critical race theory, and 8 years ago it was racism, and 12 years ago it was socialism. There's going to be another buzzword, right? Right now it's Christian nationalism. I think in just like wider culture, that's just going to be the word with an accepted use that the media has. It is what it is. But I do think with the conversation with your neighbor, you can help him understand you're not a Christian nationalist. Nobody really is a Christian nationalist, like what is being thrown around, right? What is a Christian nationalist? Well, here's a strict definition. Someone that believes in a theocracy. I've never actually met this person, right? Here's some other like weaker definitions. That's still really not us. Are we out here trying to implement like a Muslim state of Christianity in America? No, right? Nobody is, right? Here's what I believe. I'm a Christian, therefore I'm going to vote X, Y, and Z on these 3 issues, all right? And I want you to vote how you vote on these issues. And guess what? It's politics. I want my side to win. And we're going to go to the potluck next week. And we're going to, we're going to invite you over for ribs on Memorial Day, and we're going to watch the Indy 500, right? Like that's what we're going to do. I personally, that's how I see it going. This is going to be a conversation that you win individually, while the rest of the world just kind of takes it down this vein of like, well, all Christians are Christian nationalists.
Yeah, I kind of think that's the way a lot of the conversation has to go, because You know, the scriptures tell us that the world's going to hate us. The world is going to hate us, and we have to accept that. But what we can recognize is that our neighbors can love us because they'll know who we really are. So I'm gonna wrap that up. If you run over 10 minutes each for 3 sessions, you run over a half hour. So that's kind of how it goes. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. Feel free to stick around and talk to John as much as you want, as long as he's able to stay. I won't lock up